Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto was born before the Nine Tails attacked. Really, how much can small things affect the world? Little things like the color of someone's hair? Their mentor? Maybe, their date of birth? Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 45, Official Recovery. Naruto was not expecting the flying tackle, and was subsequently bowled over by the red blur that took him in the chest. All he saw for a few moments was a veil of red hair before glistening violet eyes leaned back, although not far enough back to stop squeezing the life out of him. "My little Naru-chan," Kushina murmured as she finally let him go, somewhat awkwardly straddling him as she held his face between her hands. Her brow crinkled slightly as she turned him this way and that, the novelty of the situation managing to keep Naruto quiet during all of this. Well, not so little now. Her gaze softened as she leaned back in, wrapping her arms around him and just holding him there. "I missed you growing up." "Hi to you too, Mom," he finally managed, glancing past her to where his father looked on, smiling at the scene. "Hey Dad." The Yondai man nodded, looking somewhat awkward as he shuffled in place, as though worried about approaching any further. "Son." The monosyllable seemed to trigger something in Kushina as the woman suddenly sat bolt upright, glaring at the man. "Is that any way to greet our Naruto after all this time, you big dem flake?" Minato wavered in place, looking far from the fearsome Hokage the world remembered him as. Naruto was okay with that though, this was the father he remembered. "Well, I don't know how he feels about me, after what I did." He gave a weak, sheepish smile. "I don't want to get punched or some dash." The breath was taken out of him as his wife suddenly launched backwards, burying her fist into his stomach and doubling him over, hair splayed out around her like the fox she had once housed. In an all-too-sweet voice, that Naruto found disconcertingly familiar, she whispered, "There, problem solved. Now man up and come greet our son, Date Bonnet." A significantly more winded Minato lurched over just as Naruto was picking himself up off the ground, smiling fondly at the tableau right out of his memories. "For the record, I probably wouldn't have hit you. I've sort of gotten over it by now." Minato smiled, stepping forward to wrap his son in a hug, only to grunt again as another fist lodged itself in his stomach. "Sort of. I deserved that," the older man gasped, only to find his voice muffled as Naruto suddenly pulled him up, wrapping the man in a hug. "I missed you, Dad." When they both heard a distinctive throat clear, Naruto simply opened one of his arms, admitting Kushina into the hug. "I missed you both, so much." He wasn't sure how long they all stayed in that embrace, but it was Minato who eventually pulled away. "I have to ask, son, how did you know about, well, us?" Naruto put on a bit of a tired smile at that. He hadn't forgotten why he was here, but he couldn't help but feel a small swell of pride. "I didn't drop my studies after you guys were, you know. Seals have been my life for the last 12 years, and I've had a lot of time to examine this one." He motioned to his stomach. "So it was only a matter of time before I figured out what you had done." Minato's brow creased. "But to mess with your own Jinchuriki seal, even for this, seems a bit dangerous." The redhead preempted. "Probably, but trust me, I know my own seal inside out. I've even made a few modifications to prevent too much of the fox's chakra leaking into my system." "Still not completely sure why you did that, by the way." The blonde rubbed the back of his head, purposefully avoiding the pointed stare from his wife. "I was hoping you would use that power to become stronger. Clearly you, didn't need it." Naruto shrugged. "Can't say it didn't come in handy a few times. I've never lacked for energy." At that, Kushina gained an expression he would have thought more appropriate on Jiraiya. "I imagine any lady friends you might have had certainly wouldn't have complained." She only allowed the awkward pause that followed to languish for a few seconds before busting out laughing at the identical red expressions on her husband and son's face. "Oh, you two are just too alike." Both only realized that they were rubbing the back of their head in identical movements when they caught each other doing it. It really was strange. Naruto was almost 20, so his parents, as they looked here, were only a few years older than him. He and Minato could be brothers. So people tell me, he admitted, his blush not quite dying down as he reached into one of his pockets and threw a Hiraishin kunai at his father. The man caught it deftly, barely giving it a glance before smiling proudly at the younger Namikaze. In more ways than one it seems. Naruto felt another upsurge of pride, before something darker settled in his stomach. You guys had no idea how long I've waited for this moment, ever since the first time I realized exactly what you had done with the seal. I was saving it, knowing this could only happen once. His parents quickly mirrored his melancholy. I wasn't going to use it so soon, I wanted to wait and make sure I could tell you everything. I could have told you about my wedding, let you know the name of your grandchild, or grandchildren. I wanted to make sure I had done everything that I could have to make you proud. He nearly flinched as he felt Kushina's smaller hand slip into his own, glancing up into eyes almost identical to his own. Naruto, my Naruto, I don't care what you do. I don't care who you chose to love, I don't even care if you didn't become a shinobi. I would always be proud of you. Whether it was today, or decades from now you would still be my little Sachi, and I would cherish this moment just as much. He felt something shift deep inside of him as he gripped her hand tightly. I don't know how much I deserve that. I came here for a reason, I've never felt so lost in my life and I just didn't know where else to turn. Still, even though he felt exactly that way, one look into his mother's face seemed to put all of that aside for a moment. It was an expression that had lost nothing from nostalgia, it was just the way he remembered, so full of warmth and unconditional love. She gently pulled him to the floor. He hadn't noticed but at some point their surroundings had shifted from the dank room in front of the Cubia's cage, to a strange, glittering void of floating lights, and, still holding his hand, sat across from him with his father. Tell us about it. So he did. He explained everything he could, from the sealing of the Sanbai, to the theft of the scroll, to the discovery of his sister and the impromptu Jinchuriki ritual. He explained how he thought Sukuru had been dead this whole time, something that seemed to trouble them deeply, and shared his uncertainty with how to move forward. His parents seemed impressed by his various exploits, but respectfully held their silence until he began to wind down, having vented quite thoroughly. It's just. I've had a whole life to learn everything I need. A lifetime of being a shinobi, with guidance from the right people at the right time. A lifetime coming to terms with the woman I love, and how to go about showing her that. I've even been eased into having a team, learning how to deal with subordinates from Umbu, and children from memories of my own genin days. Everything came at the proper time. He hung his head slightly. But I don't know how to be a brother, I feel like that opportunity was stolen from me, and from her. He paused, taking in the thoughtful looks of his parents, at least until his father smiled suddenly and without warning. Naruto, life just isn't like that. Before the redhead could argue, he carried on in that soft, attention-grabbing tone that had always seen him as the center of any room he was in. I remember when Kushina first told me I was going to be a father, we were both still so young. I was thinking about my career, about where I stood in the world. The war was just winding down and Hiruzen had begun to take personal interest in me. Jiraiya-sensei was hardly subtle with his hinting that I was being groomed for the hat. The blonde leaned back on his hands, staring up at the featureless sky with a strange expression. Then you came along, a little bundle of chaos that seemed purpose-built to throw my life as off-kilter as possible. He glanced down, still smiling. Don't get me wrong, I was thrilled. I had never really had anything like a family before, you know your grandparents passed when I was very young. But that didn't change the fact I felt wholly unprepared for anything like, well, you. He sighed. What you've told us about Sukuru. I thought she had died too, but don't let the unexpected situation distract you from the fact that, yes, while an opportunity was taken from you, that doesn't mean the one you have been presented is any less significant. You have your sister back, our daughter is still alive, and while the circumstances aren't ideal. Kushina nodded emphatically. If I wasn't just a chakra imprint, I'd be out there strangling that old one-eyed bastard myself. Minato allowed himself a bemused smile before continuing, you can't treat this as anything less than it is. An opportunity to reclaim something you thought you would never have. He shuffled until he was in front of his son, quickly wrapping Naruto in a hug. From everything you've told us so far, I have no doubts you'll handle this as splendidly as you have everything else. He leaned back, propping both hands on Naruto's shoulders. Have faith in yourself, Naruto, because we certainly do. When he leaned back he could see he had left the redhead a lot to consider. It's going to be really difficult, isn't it? She'll be like a stranger, with who knows what put in her head about me. I think I'm most afraid that she'll wake up and hate me. I'm not sure if I could deal with that. You will, Kushina reassured him, sharing a nod with her husband. And besides, when has anything worth doing been easy? You think raising a rambunctious kid like you was a walk in the park? That at least earned a chuckle from all three of them. Naruto, she's your sister. There's a connection there, no matter how buried it might be. She glanced up briefly in thought. I'll tell you something Mito-Basin once told me. She said, Uzumaki is more than just a name, it's more than just our red hair, or our ability with seals, or our longevity. It's an understanding, that family means more than blood, that it's a connection. She told me that as long as another Uzumaki lived, I would never be alone in anything I did. It got me through a really rough time in my life. I think you told me that story when I was a kid, Naruto mused, almost ponderously. He had forgotten about it, it was so long ago. I understand, I think. It's just so hard sometimes without you guys. There were so many times in my life that I could have used advice like this, and the knowledge that this will really be the last time I see you. He nearly jumped when Kushina put her hands on his. Not the last time. His expression shifted quickly to one of rebuke. But I certainly don't want to see you again anytime soon. I want my baby to have a long, happy life so you have so many more stories to tell us when we see you again. She was glad for the weak smile that earned as her voice turned soft again. But in that vein, let's not waste the time we have now. I want to hear everything. She sat back, making a big show of making herself comfy despite the ground having no discernible features. Now, you mentioned grandchildren. Time didn't seem to work properly in whatever pseudo-space they inhabited. His senses told him he had been here for barely a few minutes, and yet they had spent hours now just talking. It still wasn't nearly enough. He had made it through what he considered the most important moments in his life: Anko, Itachi, Shisui, Umbu, his genin, the war, Hea, his child, becoming Hokage, the various enemies he had made, faced, and defeated, and even a brief recap of the situation in Mizu with more emphasis on his worries as the Hokage. In return his parents told him some of the stories they had never managed while they were around, including their individual perspectives on that fateful night. By now he was just regaling his parents with as many anecdotes as he could, training with his first team, moments spent with Anko, particularly noteworthy missions, messing with his students, those rare moments of clarity with Hiruzen, and none of it seemed to be enough. He wanted to tell them everything, to assuage that little voice that told him this was it, this was all the time they had to learn what they could about their son. But the march of time was as inevitable as it was unstoppable. It started out as a vague sensation in the back of his head, and even when it became impossible not to notice he pressed on, ignoring it as long as possible. Eventually though, they too had taken note, glancing down at their bodies with worry. This wasn't what they had been left here for. They were supposed to be emergency fail-safes for the seal, used up mostly in one go. Drawing them out like this, minimizing the limited energy they used up, just prolonged the inevitable. His parents were fading away, the chakra they were composed of slowly burning out. Abruptly, Naruto quit, not even bothering to finish the story about Shisui managing to get them fireworks that nearly ended with them burning down a training ground. His mother had been clearly amused, but by this point Naruto's heart wasn't in it. Minato and Kushina were semi-transparent now, little more than ghosts clinging on to the few precious seconds they had left. I don't want you to go, the redhead said, barely able to get his voice above a whisper. You knew this was coming, son, and even this much was more than most get, Minato informed him, no less saddened by the revelation but putting on the stoicism that had made him so fearsome as a leader. I'm so happy with the man you've grown into, I couldn't have asked for any more, or for a better son, Kushina said, not bothering to hide her emotions as tears streamed down her face. Please, tell Anko that she has our blessing, she sounds like a wonderful young woman. And tell Sakura that her mother loves her. Her father too, Minato added, struggling to keep his features straight now. And let Hiruzen and Jiraiya know, I don't blame them. And you better dote on your child doubly for us. Kushina warbled, trying for a smile but failing somewhere in the attempt. More importantly, Minato started, looking worrying down at his hand as it gently faded away. Remember that. Kushina joined in. We love you, they said together. Naruto leaned forward, to pull them into the last hug he might ever have with his parents, only to stumble forward, with nothing there to catch him. He looked up, but they were gone. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the hospital room, although it was more appropriate to say he had never left. It had felt like hours, and the experience had screwed up his internal clock, but a quick glance at a nearby window told him only a few minutes had passed. It was so surreal, like a twisted genjutsu, but the tears he could feel on his cheeks were all too real. He took a moment to recompose himself, slumping bonelessly into a nearby chair to stare up at the ceiling. His eyes raked over the speckled paint for a few seconds before he breathed out a single, long exhale. The constricting vice that had been tightening around his heart since finding his sister was still there, but it had relaxed tremendously. His parents' words had gone a long way in comforting his more personal anxieties. When he finally stood again, his features were neutral and his head clear for the first time all day. Resolute on the path forward, he crossed to the bed, lighting his hand up in warm, green chakra. He was no mednin, but he knew enough about battlefield first aid to wake someone up from an induced sleep. Tsunade would rant at him endlessly for this, and he was subverting a few protocols by doing this alone, but it was his sister, he needed to do this now, while it was just the two of them. It took a few moments for her to awake, a few more to do so visibly. She didn't start, or look around confusedly, she simply sat up and surveyed the room with a clinical detachment before staring at him emotionlessly, face carefully arranged. Having her stare at him so blankly was off-putting and he lost track of what he had planned to say, instead settling on, "Do you know where you are?" It was disturbing how she made no indication of hearing him, but answered all the same. The Konoha Hospital, private ward. She glanced at the window, where the early morning sun made streaks of light through the blinders, room 4E. Her voice was toneless, lacking in inflection. The precision too, it was unsettling, as if she had no understanding of the gravitas of her situation and was used to giving nothing but clean, factual reports her entire life. Naruto had to quickly clamp down on a surge of anger that welled up in him directed at a certain old bastard. "And do you know who I am?" Again, it didn't even seem like she heard him, no tilt of the head, no blink, no physical tells whatsoever. "Of course, Hokage-sama." Strained through the emotionless filter of her voice, the title sounded more like an insult. "I'm your brother, Sukuru," he said softly, the first hint of earnest emotion beginning to break through as the full weight of what had been done to his little sister finally began to dawn on him. "It's me, Naruto." Finally, the girl moved, tilting her head up ever so slightly so her eyes met his. "My name is not Sukuru, my most recent designation was K, and my brother is dead." The stark way she said it, as if stating the sky was blue, or kunai are sharp, threw him completely. "Your name is Sukuru Namikaze, why do you think your brother is dead?" He had been expecting one answer, so he was not prepared when she intoned, "Because I killed him." From what we were able to gather, it seems she, and agents like her, are committed to quite a monstrous course of training, Inoichi said solemnly, staring at the passive blonde through the one-way mirror that divided the Spartan interrogation room. "I would hesitate to put Elite Umbu through the kinds of things I saw being done to kids in her memories." The specific instance she was referring to though. The Yamanaka patriarch grimaced, it seemed to have been somewhat of a graduation ceremony akin to the old Bloody Mist, although taken to a grisly extreme. Naruto didn't look at him, he just stared resolutely through the mirror. He hated seeing his sister like this, kept like a criminal, but it stood to reason that until they found out exactly what had been done to her, this was the safest path forward. "Don't hesitate for my sake." Inoichi nodded. They seemed to be partnered with another operative at a young age, encouraged to be as close as possible, operating in two-man cells for the duration of the training. A failure by one is seen as a failure for both and, well, the punishments are not light. Under different circumstances I would consider it an effective, if not barbaric, method of promoting exquisite teamwork. Shimura-san, apparently thought otherwise. At the end of their training they're pitted against one another in a fight to the death. From what I could surmise, it is all in an effort to force a traumatic break on the surviving operative, making them more malleable to certain conditioning. So she was brainwashed, Naruto surmised, his face not betraying the roiling anger that sloshed around inside him. In a sense, but not quite. Brainwashing implies conditioning a subject to act in a way they normally wouldn't. What Danzo did, well, it's more akin to programming from a blank slate. The operative either suffers from a severe breakdown, after which I can only make educated guesses as to what happens, or they repress their emotions as an extreme coping mechanism. There are other aspects of the training that promote this outcome too, which leads me to believe it was the intended effect. Naruto's lips twisted slightly. Hiruzen told me the main point of contention between him and Danzo was emotion in a shinobi. Hiruzen believed it empowered people, allowed them to go beyond what they were normally capable. Danzo believed it inhibited them, constrained them from their true potential as a weapon. Apparently, he decided that a theoretical debate wasn't enough. If I can be candid. Inoichi broached hesitantly, earning a stiff nod. I've never seen anything quite like this, or, if I can fix this. Naruto rounded on him quite suddenly, forcing him to back up against the wall. My sister isn't something to be fixed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. And I understand that, but... The words nearly caught in his throat from the look the Hokage gave him. This isn't simply a case of reversing psychological damage, this is all she knows. Even if we treated the trauma that caused her to repress her emotions, there is still the fact that all she has known, her entire life, is a brutal regime of training, total subservience to a sociopathic tyrant and a complete disregard for typical human morality. A great deal of the fire drained from Naruto's eyes at the frank summation of the situation, leaving him much more delicate than the Yamanaka had ever seen the vibrant young Hokage. Then we do what we can. For now, I'm releasing her into my custody. I have to argue against that, Hokage-sama. The first few days could be the most crucial in understanding how to. He trailed off at the glare sent his way. I will be bringing her back here every day, so that you can do what you can in helping her. But she is coming home with me, where she belongs. Inoichi hesitated a moment before nodding. Very well, in which case I need to tell you that it is very important to maintain a comfortable, non-hostile environment around her at all times. Too much stimulus could evoke reactions that I'm currently not prepared to diagnose. Naruto nodded. She's my sister, I would give her nothing less. Not to cause any offense, Hokage-sama, I was talking about Anko. The redhead managed a humorless smile. Anything else I should know? Actually, there was one thing. From the examination of the other root agents you brought in, we were able to identify a particular seal inscribed on the back of their tongues. He brought out a piece of paper that one of the Umbu more versed in Fuinjutsu had copied the seal onto. Naruto only gave it a brief look. Curse seal, based on the location, probably designed as a kill switch if the operative said the wrong thing. I'd have to examine it to know for sure. Inoichi nodded, handing the paper over. We presumed as much. The funny thing is, Sukuru doesn't seem to have one. Any thoughts why? Naruto sighed, looking back through the glass at his sister. She hadn't moved so much as an inch. Because Nuzumaki is too valuable to waste, we're perfect Jinchuriki hosts. Even saying it left a bitter taste in his mouth, as if you could measure the intrinsic worth of somebody based on such arbitrary characteristics. Inoichi seemed to share his opinion, clearly thinking of the agent that had been revealed as a Yamanaka previously thought dead. We still have a few tests to run, but we should be able to release her to your custody tonight. I'm not sure if you want to dash. I'll wait, Naruto preempted without hesitation. Well, in that case. Ino-chan. Daddy, the girl whined as she poked her head around the door, I asked you not to call me that while I'm working. Sorry honey, I need you to show the Hokage to the waiting room. Ino started at the realization she was in front of the village's leader, but recovered admirably. Of course, this way Hokage-sama. Despite the circumstances and the matters weighing on his mind, Naruto was who he was and couldn't help but smile at the sight of a father intentionally messing with their kid. He briefly wondered what his own team were doing at the moment as he was led through the Tianai complex. It was a surprisingly nice building for what went on inside, all pastel walls and nicely carpeted floors. Eventually Ino led him to a pleasant room with a few comfy couches and a counter along one wall that held plates of food and a coffee maker. He only realized the silence had dragged on a little too long when he noticed Ino shuffle awkwardly on the spot. "So, you're working here now?" He clearly wasn't at his best if that was all he could come up with. He remembered Field promoting the girl to Chunin a few months before, and it wasn't uncommon for children to follow their parents' careers once they'd graduated past Genin. "Shadowing my dad, yeah," Ino replied brightly, taking the conversation like it was a life preserver. "I would prefer to go more into therapy, helping people, but the best study for psychology is in T&I, he filled in for her. "Right, it's a lot more, hands-on than I thought it would be, but I'm learning a lot." "That's good." And Naruto meant it. The genuine enjoyment he could see from Ino when she talked about her work was strangely soothing. It was nice to just have a banal conversation after having his world upended. Seeing a pretty girl smile was a nice bonus, although she was a bit young for his tastes. She started, "You're nothing like Sakura describes you. I thought you'd be a lot more, I don't know, intimidating." The redhead gave a weary smile. "I try to save that for the people who deserve it." "It's nice," she amended quickly, clearly conscious of offending him. "I mean, growing up with Sandaime-sama, you start to see the post of Hokage as kind of unattainable. He was always the impossibly wise old man that would visit the academy, always knowing just what to say. Seeing somebody so." She was good at hiding her emotions, her father's work no doubt, but she couldn't disguise the faint hint of red that entered her cheeks. "Young, as the Hokage. It's encouraging, like the bar isn't so high, I've never really thought about it, the job sort of snuck up on me." "Really?" The blonde seemed genuinely taken aback. "But you're Naruto Namikaze. Last time I checked," he quipped with a wan smile. "Sorry," she quickly backpedaled, visibly abashed, "but when you meet somebody so famous, you just don't expect them to be so human," he offered, thinking back to the first time he had met Jiraiya and how quickly the well of respect for the man's sealing abilities had evaporated. "Yeah," she finished a little lamely. "At the same time though, I suppose it is kind of intimidating." When the teams were announced, she looked up as if just realizing how long ago that was, nearly making him chuckle. She should wait until she was his age. "I made it a priority to know who everybody's sensei were. The more I found out about you, well, sort of brings your own achievements into question, doesn't it? As the Sandaime keeps reminding me, I'm a product of a slightly different time. The more I'm reminded, the more I think you guys are better off." He smiled. "He has a way of doing that." Ino mirrored his expression. "That's more like what Sakura said you were like." The redhead sank onto one of the couches, motioning for her to sit opposite him. The girl clearly considered the offer, glancing towards the door and weighing up whether she should get back to work. "But then, how often does the Hokage invite you for a private chat?" Ignoring his outstretched hand, she cheerfully settled in next to him. At a respectable distance, she knew he was engaged after all. Slightly bemused, Naruto wasn't put off at all. "So, what do my cute little students say about me?" When Inoichi came to get them, nearly an hour later, Naruto was a great deal more relaxed, laughing and talking with Ino easily over aimless little things that had completely put his mind off the pressures mounting on his shoulders. He could definitely see why she wanted to go into therapy. Even when Inoichi cleared his throat, reminding Naruto of what he had to do, his grin only faded into a small, resigned smile. "Thanks Ino, it's been very nice talking with you." "No problem Naruto-sensei. Oh, when your sister recovers I'd love to come visit sometime, help her get acclimatized with some things, girl stuff." The redhead nodded. He had gotten a good feel for the girl over the time they had spent talking and could tell the offer was sincere. "I think that would be nice." She waved brightly as Inoichi led him out and back through the complex to a different, smaller waiting room. Each footstep seemed to pull at Naruto's regained good mood until the uncomfortable weight settled in his stomach once again. It only worsened when he rounded the corner and saw his sister sat there, perfectly still with her hands folded over her lap. "Come on Sukuru, it's time to go home. Chapter 46, Official Adjustments. Sukuru stared at the small, framed photo without so much as a flicker of emotion passing across her features. It was, as far as anybody was aware, the only picture of her that existed. It showed Minato and Kushina smiling brightly at the camera, Naruto peeking up from above their shoulders from where he was perched on his father's back. What she was staring at, however, was the lump of Kushina's stomach that was just pronounced enough to be noticeable. "I remember that day," Naruto said, voice subdued. "It was the day our parents told me that I was going to have a sister. I didn't understand, of course. For the longest time I thought you were going to be a fox and we were just getting a pet. I got a lot of mixed signals back then from Mom being a Jinchuriki. But I remember being really happy with the idea." He screwed up his eyes for a moment, trying to throw his mind back to when he was that young. It was difficult. "I remember thinking that it would be a lot of fun to boss you around," he mused, lips quirking up at the edges. "I think I was going to teach you some tricks. By the time I figured out what having a sister actually meant, I don't think my ideas changed all that much. Funny how that works, me being the Hokage and you technically a shinobi under my command." He looked down, but she didn't so much as move through his entire speech. "If I understand correctly, you are trying to form some empathetic bond with me, yes?" She could see him try to repress the wince. He did that quite often when she spoke. Such poor control of one's reactions would have been harshly punished en route. "I'm not trying, Sukuru, you're my sister. We're family. That is the part I do not understand. What does us being biologically related have to do with any affectations or special considerations? Our relationship as I understand it is that you are my Hokage, and I am your tool. All of this." She glanced down at the picture again, something uncomfortable rising in the back of her mind. "All of this seems unnecessary. You're only saying that because you don't know any better. You are saying I am deficient in some manner." "No." Naruto was in front of her in a flash, kneeling and holding her hands. She showed no response to the act, not even trying to pull her hands away. "I don't think that at all, but what Danzo's done to you, it shouldn't have been this way. You were supposed to grow up with me, make friends, have a family. I was instructed that dwelling on alternative possibilities to unaccountable situations was inefficient and detrimental to subsequent mission success." Naruto sighed as he straightened up, taking the place on the couch next to her and pulling her gently into his side. "In a way, you're right." Sukuru wasn't sure what to make of the situation. Nothing in her training had ever prepared her for this. However, when that strange fluttering feeling rose in her stomach again, seemingly a reaction to the warmth of the body next to her, she knew to crush it down. That was always the response. Feeling was weakness, emotion a distraction. Her training hadn't been put to such extensive use since she had put a sword through the boy that had truly been her brother. "All right, Sukuru, we're going to run through a different scenario now." This was the third Yamanaka she had been introduced to. Inoichi only seemed to supervise her sessions, likely doing much of the planning before handing it off to another member of his family. Sukuru didn't see much in the point of it. The questions were always inane. The frustrating part, that was the label they had given the irritating sensation when it cropped up, was that despite her perfectly logical answers they always disagreed with her. That was another one, disappointment. She knew of the emotions and their effects in a purely academic sense. They were important to recognize in others, putting a name to them when she was apparently feeling them though. That was something else. "Very well. All right. You're in a shop, buying food, and you've noticed the clerk is overcharging you. What do you do?" Sukuru kept her face restrained, but could feel the first flutters of irritation. It was like a phantom burn at the back of her mouth. That was how she remembered it. What was the purpose of this? En route rations had always been provided as needed. It was a much more effective system than acquiring the food for oneself. She settled her thoughts and instead pretended she was on a mission. Strange occurrences often happened on missions. "I presume I do not have the money to afford the overpriced food." She found that offering counter-questions often seemed to improve the mood of the interviewer. They called themselves a therapist, but she remained unconvinced this wasn't some elaborate form of interrogation. She personally believed Root's methods to be far more succinct and effective. "Let's say you have the money. Then I accept the overpricing. As long as I obtain the food, then there is little other purpose in holding excess money. There it was. The man often kept his expression schooled into a serene smile, but the slight downward cast of his eyes was indicative of a wrong answer. But what if you wanted to spend the money on something else? Such as? She couldn't think of what else money might acquire her. Although, applying the logic that they expected her to purchase food, it stood to reason all of her equipment would be self-funded. However, she knew for a fact that kunai and standard mission wear were provided to regular shinobi based on the mission parameters. By definition, anything purchased that is not an amenity would be a luxury and is therefore extraneous. The man didn't sigh. The first one had done that a lot, but they had rotated him out. She knew the signs though. For all they thought her emotionally stunted, she could recognize the subtle shifts in their body language. Let's say you don't have the money then. Anko cursed lightly as she crested the bottom of the stairs. She used to have great fun bounding down them or occasionally sliding down the banisters. Nowadays she was lucky if she could make it down one flight without her ankles swelling up, her back throwing a tantrum and feeling generally nauseous. She was still excited about having a kid, but damn would the little brat have some making up to do for the hell she was going through. One of the few upsides of all this was having a partner that could teleport. Honestly, even she was disgusted by some of the odd cravings she'd been having, but having somebody who could effectively go anywhere in the country to pick up whatever she needed was a blessing. Right now, she was desperately hankering for some melon, after basically a lifetime of barely touching the fruit. It was often disconcerting how much her hormones seemed able to influence her decisions. She paused in the living room, observing the thatch of messy blonde hair poking up over the back of the couch. She tried her best to be tolerant of Naruto's little sister. She was as supportive as possible over all this, still able to remember a time when the loss had been a fresh wound to the redhead. She couldn't deny though, that she found the girl's tacit lack of outward emotion more than a little creepy. She sighed. Naruto clearly wanted to be there for his sister as much as possible, but he was still the Hokage and couldn't spend too much time away from the office. That left Sukuru alone much of the day. She mostly pottered around the house aimlessly. Often though, she just sat there on the couch, hands folded over each other as she stared at a wall. It could be mistaken for meditation, but Anko knew what meditation looked like. Sukuru just sat there, doing nothing. Never thought about getting a hobby? She asked, unsurprised when Sukuru didn't seem startled by her presence. The creak of her coming down the stairs was enough of a giveaway. What do you mean? She waddled around the couch, settling into the big plush chair that had increasingly become her happy place over the past few months. You know, something to do during the day when you can't be around other people. I've been prohibited from training until my evaluations are complete. She rolled her eyes. It was difficult to remember that, for all Sukuru had been taught, and her education had been extensive, it was a very directed education, prone to gaps that others took for granted. Training isn't a hobby. Unless your name was Might Guy, but she left that part out. Hobbies are. She blinked, actually drawing a blank on the best way to explain. Hobbies are a way to blow off steam when other aspects of your life become too stressful. Operatives are encouraged to engage in physical activity when unduly stressed. And you're back to training. You've got the wrong end of the stick, kid. Hobbies aren't something to do towards any specific goal, it's something you do for the pleasure of doing it. I assume you do not mean the generic satisfaction of completing an assigned task, such as becoming competent in a new technique. No, I mean actual pleasure. For instance, I enjoy a good tea ceremony, and have spent a lot of time learning how to perform many varieties. I do this because it's relaxing, not because I'd get any particular utility out of it. I can think of many useful skills the knowledge of tea ceremonies provides. Anko clicked her tongue irritably. How can I put this in a way you understand? Her fingers drummed a rhythmic beat on the armrest. I assume they made you pretty good with kunai and root. All operatives were required to have adequate skill with a number of different weapons. I personally had exceptional skill and accuracy with shuriken jutsu. See, now if I didn't know you any better, I'd assume that was a hint of pride poking out of your mask. Sukuru said nothing to this, just staring at her blankly. Right, so you can hit a target, that's a useful skill. Do me a favor and grab some of those rubber balls Naruto keeps in his study. I was specifically instructed that the study was off limits. I cannot disobey an order from the Hokage, it breaks the chain of command. Anko grinned, hauling herself off the chair only to plop down next to the girl, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. But you're his little sister, and little sisters always disobey their big brothers. He wants you to be his little sister a lot more than he wants to be your Hokage, right? Sukuru just nodded. He has made that very clear. Good, then go get the balls. The slightest crease appeared in Sukuru's brow, the closest she came to showing anything. After a moment's thought she stood and hurried up the stairs, returning moments later with a box of rubber balls. This feels irregular. That's the spirit. Now, watch me closely. She grunted slightly as she leaned forward to pick 3 balls out of the box, saying, "Can you see the utility in this?" As she began juggling the balls with adroit skill. Sukuru watched carefully as the balls exchanged hands, moving up and down as Anko played with the throwing height. I can see how the exercise would improve hand-eye coordination and dexterity. You're thinking too mechanically. Can you see any inherent use in the act itself? No, it seems to be a pointless display of a debatably useless skill. Good, Anko chirped happily, suddenly redirecting the balls and forcing Sukuru to catch them awkwardly. Now you try. Sukuru stared at her skeptically, which was more of an expression than she usually had. And this is a hobby. The woman shrugged. Hobbies are usually extensions of a pre-existing skill or interest that, in of themselves, don't serve any inherent point other than to improve the skill. You're good at throwing kunai, ergo, you should be pretty good with juggling. The blonde looked back down at the balls and tried to copy Anko's movements, only serving to quickly scatter the balls around the room and earn a laugh from the older woman. She wasn't sure what the feeling was that flamed up inside her, but for once she didn't clamp down on it, it felt appropriate. Her eyes narrowed imperceptibly as she pulled 3 more balls from the box, trying it again. This time she managed to catch the balls again, but forgot to continue the maneuver. After a few more attempts she was quite casually juggling all 3 balls in exactly the manner Anko had shown. A very different feeling resulted from that, a buoyant, bubbly sort of thing. That one's called pride, Anko noted with a small smile. Sukuru hadn't even noticed the tiny smile she now wore as she ably threw and caught the balls in their rhythmic pattern. Is that the purpose of hobbies? To conflate a simplistic, repetitive task with a system of personal reward. Her tone might have been edging on curious. In part, Anko agreed, pulling another ball out of the box with a grin and throwing at the girl, immediately destroying her rhythm. That felt unnecessarily disruptive. If that's your way of saying you find me annoying, you are learning, Anko shot back, motioning for the girl to pick up the balls. Now do it with 4. When Naruto came home a few hours later, not a moment later than he could, he found a curious sight waiting for him. Sukuru was stood in the middle of the living room, couches and table pushed towards the walls, surrounded by the rubber balls he used to train the Rasengan. Her face was set into a mask of concentration as she carefully balanced the juggling of 5 balls at once. Her eyes tracked rapidly in time with her hands until she threw one a little too high and upset the balance. She caught 4 of them, but the fitch bounced off it brothers and went careening off to the other side of the room. For a brief moment Sukuru's eyes narrowed in the closest approximation of irritation he had seen from her, before she picked up another ball and returned to her task. She didn't even acknowledge his entrance with a clipped Hokage-sama as she normally did. "What's going on?" he asked, unsure whether to be happy or bemused at the apparent show of normality. "I have a hobby," Sukuru stated in her factual tone, careful to keep her attention on the balls. "It serves no purpose." "I can see that," he mused. "You're very good." Sukuru chose that moment to lose control again, this time not with irritation, but apparent surprise. He could only assume as much from the ever so slight widening of her eyes and separation of her lips before she reschooled her features. "I'll let you keep at it then," he muttered, moving past her towards the kitchen, where Anko stood in the doorway wearing a wry smile. Her good mood could be equally attributed to the bowl of raw cookie dough she was eating. "You're doing, I take it." "Pfft, those boffins at TNI may be good at messing with people's heads, but I think they're missing a trick with her. They're trying to rehabilitate something she never had in the first place, she just needs time to discover all of the things she might have had." She looked up and planted a quick, sugary kiss on his lips. Who understands being childish better than me? Can't argue with that, Naruto replied, turning to look back at his sister with a fond smile. He jerked in place a moment later, suddenly rushing towards the stairs. Where are you going? Anko called after him. Are you kidding? I'm getting the camera. Sakura tried to maintain a light, airy smile as she walked through the village. It didn't match her inward feelings in the slightest, but she had been recommended by her therapist, not that she openly used the term, to try emoting a bit more. In her experience though, people seemed to dislike it when she walked around scowling from her irritation. It really was rather backwards in her opinion. They wanted her to show her emotions, which was the reverse of everything she had been taught growing up, but people clearly didn't like seeing the negative ones. So, a slightly forced smile it was. She was somewhat proud of it. At least, she thought she was. Nailing down the specifics of her feelings when they came at her erratically was still difficult. But she had practiced this smile in the mirror over the past few weeks and she figured she had it down pat. People certainly seemed more accepting of her occasional slips when she smiled at them. Although occasionally it landed her in situations such as this one. Social events still perplexed her, even after 3 months in her brother's, still a concept she was coming to terms with, care. So, when a few girls her age, apparently all of them familiar with Naruto in some way or another, asked her to come out with them, she wasn't sure what to expect. Shopping for clothes, and all of the banal frivolity that came with it, was not on her list. Oh, she knew it was an expected activity for teenagers. Anko had been providing her with all sorts of books that covered it in detail, she just never expected to engage with it herself. She had a perfectly functional set of clothes, and her brother had provided more whenever she asked. Going out and getting them herself, while also having to pander to the excessively obnoxious whims of the other girls, just seemed pointless. Or perhaps she was just annoyed because they had interrupted her drawing. When he calmed down from his excitement over her juggling, Naruto was beyond enthused to introduce her to a whole swathe of potential hobbies. Few captured her in the way the juggling had. She was now up to 9 balls, and nearly that many in kunai, but she found something interesting about sketching. The complex relationship between capturing an object with her eye, and transferring it to the page just appealed to her, somehow. She now had almost an entire sketchbook that seemed to show a sort of condensed time-lapse of a normal artist's career. She already had the excellent hand-eye coordination, so it was more about the various techniques that best translated what she saw into what she drew. She especially liked birds. They had just an interesting shape and their feathers presented the latest challenge in layering her shading so that. You're doing it again, Sakura, a voice to her right suddenly cut into her thoughts. If you keep spacing out like that, you'll walk into a wall. The blonde didn't bother turning to face the purple-haired girl, easily the most annoying of the trio in her opinion if for no other reason than she talked the most. It's unlikely that I will walk into a wall. It's common route procedure to learn to navigate changing environs with a blindfold. If anything, the manner in which you turn to talk to me will see you falling prey to such an incident. Wow, if you didn't say it in such deadpan, I'd almost take that as a comeback, Ami said, taking the apparent jibe in good humor. She's right, you know, Ino spoke up, wearing a smirk as easily as some might a SCRF. I'm surprised you haven't tripped over your own feet or that ridiculous sword already. It's not ridiculous, it's my sister's, she answered defensively, I just haven't quite grown into it yet is all, although she was noticeably more conscious of her own feet as the quartet maneuvered through the bustling crowd. You never did say why you switched, Sakura added. I thought your old sword was fine. It was more of a practice sword, too light for the style I use now. Better to adapt to a heavy sword you can grow into, than using a succession of swords that quickly become too light. That is indeed how operatives are encouraged to train en route, Sakura agreed. She found that if she occasionally added to the conversation, no matter how banal or redundant, people harassed her less to engage more deeply. See, she gets it. Well, sorry if Sakura and I aren't clued into the mysterious world of Kenjutsu, we have more interesting pursuits than swinging a metal bar around. We'll see how interesting my metal bar is when it's embedded between those precious lumps of yours. As Ino instinctively brought her arms up to her chest, scandalous, Sakura watched the interaction with mild interest. She had come to the understanding that these three were friends in the operative sense, a concept that had been translated to her in the terms of teammates you have outside of missions. However, between their instigating remarks, vocal disdain of one another and general lack of cohesion that would be fatal on a mission, she could see no truth to this. Their obsession with their appearances was also absurd. They each had the lean, lightly muscled figures born of their profession, modified only by genetic factors such as height and metabolism. In absence of strong differences in that regard, it seemed breast size was their preferred method of differentiation. Sukuru herself had taken to the practice of binding her chest when they had grown large enough to start impeding her maneuverability even slightly. On the other hand, she understood the technical advantages to the kind of figure Ino had, that was more reliably attractive in a seduction role. It all seemed so pointless. "So Sukuru, have you spotted anything you like yet?" Ino asked suddenly enough, that Ami very nearly did trip over her feet at the sudden turn. "I still don't quite understand which aspects of the clothing aesthetics I am supposed to prefer. The color seems arbitrary, and when I try to argue for utility I am told those choices are drab for whatever reason." She mimed the quotation marks as she had seen some people do to emphasize points. She was still working on the subtler intonations that were slowly being drilled into her. Ino clicked her tongue and rolled her eyes lazily. "It's not about which clothes you're supposed to prefer, you just choose whichever you like, or would look cute. That term seems entirely subjective from the many sources I've gathered." "Tell me about it," Sakura chimed in with a purposefully insightful smirk. "Have you seen Ino's choice in clothes? As if you could talk for it, you wear that white circle so much I swear you're trying to create some kind of Harino crest," the blonde shot back acerbically, suddenly rounding on Ami. "And what's wrong with what I wear?" "Hey," the violet squeaked, "don't look at me, I can't exactly comment on the skimpy fishnets aesthetic." Ino simply rounded on her friend victoriously. "See? You're outnumbered here, Sakura." "Oh please, all of Ami's fashion choices were dictated by Sensei's fiancé, that doesn't count. And if you really want to lump yourself in with her, be my guest. Don't insult Anko Shishao. How would you like it if I made fun of the pair of tits that calls itself your boss? I'd damn well like to see you try. I'm curious what color you'd make as a smear on the wall." The bickering girls pulled ahead slightly as Ino watched her careful handiwork in action like a proud, manipulative mother. "Why do you play them against one another like that?" Sukuru asked, not accusingly, just curious. "Because it's funny," Ino replied easily, flicking her hair back over her shoulder with a little playful smile. Of the many people Sukuru had been forced to become acquainted with since the dissolution of Root, Ino was one of the hardest to understand. She controlled her features as well as any Root agent, but used it to display emotion, rather than suppress it. It made for a fascinating case study for how people expected her to act. "I thought you were supposed to be friends." The platinum blonde just gave her a bemused little smile. "What are you talking about? We are friends. Sakura is my best friend and Ami is always fun to hang out with. Then why purposefully use their insecurities to cause undue friction within the social circle?" Ino didn't seem fazed by the frank question. "Why do friendly shinobi spar with one another? Practice. Friends banter like this because it forces our minds to be quick and it creates a non-hostile environment of competition." When Ino talked like this she sounded a great deal like Sukuru's various Yamanaka counselors, and she suspected this was purely for her benefit. "You told me about your hobbies, remember? It's kind of the same, we can derive harmless satisfaction from winning at this verbal sparring, with the shared understanding that we don't particularly mean what we say. Although splicing in an element of truth always adds to the fun." She gave the shorter blonde a sly wink. "But that's reserved for the advanced players." Sukuru figured that as long as Ino was behaving like a therapist, she could treat her like one. "I still don't understand the purpose of these social outings though. If the only purpose is competitive satisfaction, wouldn't your times be better served engaging and practicing a hobby to the same end?" Ino nodded patiently. "It's not just about that, people naturally fall into friendships out of a shared desire for companionship. Engaging with trusted individuals is extremely important for the psyche as it provides outlets for anxieties against a reliably frank and honest source. It depends on the kind of person you are, but that's somewhat of a heated topic of debate in my family, My dad has a lot of theories about categorizing personality types. But then, how can you be certain a person can be trusted? That was something Sukuru had never been prepared for. The very basis of her training was the core idea that nobody could be trusted, not even other root agents. That mutual understanding kept them all in check and as mission efficient as possible. In short, you really can't. But basic social reciprocity creates a sort of safety net. The more good you do for somebody else, so, the kinder you are to people, the more likely it is they will return the favor, on the then assumed basis that you will, in turn, return the favor and continue the cycle. It's one great big, enormously complex goodwill system. A kind of selfish selflessness, in the more cynical manner of looking at things. I'm a bit of realist myself, but I like to think there's some inherent good in most people, even if certain slackers strain my personal goodwill. Sounds difficult. At that at least, Ino allowed the girl a more sympathetic look. Most people don't exactly have your handicap, they learn it instinctively via their upbringing. But that doesn't mean it's impossible to teach. An important anchor for you is your brother. Hell, I don't know the Hokage very well, but I know for a fact that he loves you. Let him, and I think you'll begin to understand what I'm talking about. Sukuru looked down thoughtfully at that. Thank you for being frank with me, others are rarely so candid. Again, Ino gave a careless shrug. It comes with being from a family of mind readers, you pick up the specific methods you need to get through to different people. Her expression expertly transitioned into a sly grin. Consider it a warning, I won't be pulling my punches anymore, so I advise you to learn fast if you want to keep up. Sukuru just nodded, feeling that competitiveness she had first learned with those juggling balls. I think I understand. She looked forward and called out to the bickering girls ahead of them. Ami, your hair is inappropriately long and will inevitably act as a liability in a fight. It is also a silly color. All three of the other girls paused in total silence, each of them turning to stare at Sukuru. She just about managed not to balk under the sudden scrutiny until Ino chimed in, you heard the girl, that mop's going to be some guy's handhold one day. Faced with the more familiar aggressor, Ami reverted to a scowl. Yeah, you'd know all about that, wouldn't you, Ino? Well, if you can't handle my hairstyle, maybe you should copy your mentor more than you already do and go for the full pineapple. I bet Shikamaru would be happy to induct you into the club, Sakura couldn't resist adding, earning a laugh from all three girls and a perplexed look from Sukuru as the conversation turned to considerably lighter and less inflammatory topics. Ino gave her a little nudge from the side in a conspiratorial smile. You'll get the hang of it eventually. It would only be later, when she was thinking back on the events, that Sukuru would realize she hadn't had to force herself to smile. Naruto scrutinized the papers in front of him with the meticulous eye he usually reserved for experimental seal designs, the kind he couldn't afford to make a mistake with. Whoever was writing up May's trade agreements was a tricky bastard with their wording. Already he had found 3 potential loopholes to various clauses that he would have to amend to make sure Kiri didn't accidentally gain exclusive rights to the waters around Wave Country. He would be handing over his notes to Hiruzen later all the same. The man could spot legal meandering a mile away, but he still wanted to try this himself first. He couldn't lean on the Sandaime forever. The man was already winding down his role in the running of things, enjoying longer, more relaxing days with his family that he so desperately deserved. The man had even taken up painting, although Naruto was loath to admit that he wasn't terribly good at it. Who was he to fault a man the small comforts in his twilight years? Mostly he was just happy to see the man playing with his grandson, before Kano Amaru became a genin and went through the inevitable stage of being too mature for his jiji. He glanced up briefly when he heard Sukuru come back from her outing with the girls. He couldn't thank them enough for being so patient with his sister, just another way he could always count on his cute little students. He returned to his work, cursing under his breath when he realized he had lost his place. He had only found the right line again when Sukuru sat down next to him on the couch, stealing his concentration again. Sukuru never sat next to anyone, always preferring her own solace when she could. Hey, you okay? She nodded slowly, and he was a little surprised to see her fidgeting slightly. She usually had more control than that. Before he could wonder what had her so rattled, she leaned forward rather suddenly and awkwardly put her arms on either side of him. He froze, his next words catching in his throat as, slowly, almost robotically, she gave him a hug. He was too astonished to even return it, just sitting there, wide-eyed. "I am unsure how long a hug is supposed to last," a slightly muffled voice emerged from his chest, shocking him out of his stupor. Immediately he leaned back against her, shakily, as if the wrong move could scare her away, and returned the gesture. I'll let you know." Chapter 47, Official Incursions. Observing the clash of personalities between Haya and Sukuru had quickly become the highlight of Naruto's day. His little sister had been making strides in learning the various social cues necessary to interact with normal people. However, she tended to retreat in on herself when presented with something unfamiliar or uncomfortable. Haya was most certainly one of those things. The silver bundle of pure energy had long put the business of her clan behind her in favor of awe at her new sister figure. The very fact that Sukuru seemed so withdrawn, in stark contrast to most of the female figures in her life, only seemed to encourage her. Sneaking up on the blonde had turned into her new favorite pastime when the older Namikaze wasn't around, although the first time she did this hadn't been so humorous, as it was a potentially lethal incident. Sukuru still had some difficulty not equating surprises with ambushes. Still, it was worth all the awkwardness to watch Haya zip around the room, pelting the former Rutanen with peas launched from a spoon. The look of sheer concentration, occasionally marred by exclamations of childish frustration as Sukuru easily slapped the makeshift projectiles away from her without looking up from her reading, was priceless. Anko had taken to subtly helping the girl, maneuvering Sukuru into situations where her concentration was split before releasing the little demon on her. The house hadn't felt so alive in months. Naruto's hand whipped out, catching a deflected pea just in time to stop it ricocheting off an Umbu's mask. "Morning, Tora." He couldn't gauge the man's reaction from behind the mask, but the slight clearing of his throat told him enough to make him smile. "Sir, the alarms in Tunnel 5 have been triggered." The good humor immediately drained from Naruto's face. "Right, get the teams in position as planned." The Umbu touched his chest in silent acknowledgement of the order before vanishing as suddenly as he had arrived. The red-haired Hokage drummed his fingers along his thigh for a moment, catching the look Anko was giving him from across the room. She mouthed Danzo, questioningly, suppressing a frown when he nodded back. After a moment though she gave a small smile of encouragement, conveying with her eyes alone that she would watch the girls while he was gone. With a final smile of thanks Naruto mimed her a cheeky kiss before vanishing from the house. Thankfully the girls were too engrossed with their vegetable-themed conflict to notice. Out on the rooftops he could already see the signs of his orders being carried out. The civilians, and even most of the shinobi, wouldn't noticed anything different, but there was a certain flow to the movement of the Umbu flitting across the rooftops. The quiet repositioning of key shinobi was supposed to be low-key, it was a dangerous tactician they were dealing with. Still, Naruto couldn't fight back the satisfied smirk as Danzo rose to his bait. The man clearly thought himself above the Hokage, but pride was a vice that Naruto intended to punish the man for. The days following Sukuru's rescue had been an embarrassment for the Black Ops as the extent of Danzo's operation had been revealed. Miles of underground tunnels and bunkers, rivaling the civilian shelter system itself. The fact that all of this had been happening literally under their noses, for who knew how long, was like a punch in the gut to anybody who presided over the village's safety. The survey of the complex had been thorough, with every nook and cranny scoured for any hint of where Danzo may have gone, and just what he was doing down there. The answers, mostly, were unsatisfying. The old politician had covered his tracks well. However, Naruto knew from experience that no contingency was perfect, and if he left the man an in to finish the job, he was bound to snatch the chance. While the Umbu searched the complex from within, Naruto called in a favor to have the facilities searched from above with the Byakugan. The Jujutsu usually wasn't too good at seeing through a certain thickness of earth, but that could be compensated if the user knew what to look for. A few of the more secretive escape tunnels, and what a security nightmare those were, had been located by the Hyuga, and purposefully ignored by the Umbu. Danzo, or one of his agents, had just strolled right into one of them as if he owned the place, and Naruto was going to let him know just how big of a bear trap he had stepped in. Already Umbu were shifting about, relieving those whose skill sets were more inclined towards capture so they could flood the complex. Really, The man had been so overconfident with his special ward system that could counter the high ration. A better Fuinjutsu user would have known to layer their defenses, instead of trying to weave them into a single, more complex matrix. It was certainly stronger, but far less secure. Once Naruto had access to even a small part of the seal, he had access to all of it. Currently the silent alarms that should have been going off with the intrusion of that many Umbu were deactivated, as were the high ration blockers. As if to prove as much, he suddenly appeared alongside a small group of Umbu headed by Komaki, racing through the tunnels to their designated staging ground. No words had to be spoken and they were completely nonplussed by his appearance, simply carrying on until they were in their designated positions. They waited there, each second seeming to stretch on endlessly, until Naruto received the signal that everyone was in position. He made a simple motion with his hand before straightening, taking a moment to set his features into a congenial smile, and walking around the corner. Evening Danzo. The figure sedately making their way through the streets was distinctive in their almost single-minded path towards the center of the village. The Umbu had flagged them quickly, although none could explain or account for where the person had come from. In their simple dark robe and wide-brimmed tsuchigaza, their figure and any other discernible features were indistinct. Despite their innocuous appearance, even the surrounding civilians parted for them, feeling the indistinct weight of the figure's movements. Umbu didn't interact with the citizenry as a rule, so it was with curiosity that they watched a nearby Jonin meander his way over. The figure didn't seem inclined to stop for him until he purposefully cleared his throat. "Can I help you?" He tried to peer under the hat, but the figure's long hair and effeminate features were obscured by the tassels dangling from the edge. He couldn't make out much about their appearance. "You will move out of my path." The voice didn't help much either. It was monotone and completely androgynous, if a bit on the deeper side. The Jonin frowned lightly, but tried to keep his face jovial. It didn't do to upset the civilians if a situation was brewing. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to step to the side for a moment for a quick chat, all right?" The reaction from the route operatives Danzo had brought with him was predictable to the point of banality. Two immediately rushed the threat while one dropped back to cover Danzo's escape back down the tunnel. Naruto didn't even have to move as the first was neatly dispatched by a flurry of electrified senbon, dropping him to a twitching mess on the floor. The second learned nothing from his partner's fate and began rushing through hand seals. The moment his hands came up though, a thin strip of earth whipped out of the ground, wrapping around the operative's wrists before suddenly yanking him back down to the stone floor. His mask was shattered by the impact, revealing the face of an unconscious young teen with mousy hair. The last of the operatives, at least in this room. If the other Umbu had done their jobs, the rest were being systematically captured throughout the rest of the complex, was brought up short when the walls suddenly sprouted wooden limbs, reaching out to tangle him up. Tenzo sprouted out of a thick bough like a flower a moment later, promptly knocking the rootnin out before he could activate the seal on his tongue. All of this had happened seamlessly without Naruto having to lift a finger. "That's better, don't you think?" he asked the man who was only now turned around to face him again, features seemingly nonplussed. "A bit more conducive to a conversation. It seems you have been more successful than I had estimated in getting young Sukuru to reveal Root's operating procedures," Danzo mused calmly. "I assume then, you also know that I can activate every operative's suicide seal with a moment's thought." Naruto just grinned. "Oh, please go ahead, I'm actually quite curious about which is faster. Your thoughts?" He idly flipped a kunai produced from thin air between his hands, "Or my hand." Danzo gave him a disdainful look down his nose, but his silence was telling. "So, about that talk." The Umbu on the roof tensed slightly as the figure in the middle of the road continued to remain put. The civilians were beginning to notice the brewing situation, a few subtly moving into side streets, and a circle had begun to open around the stranger and the Jonin. "Please, I must insist you step to the side of the street for a moment, you are causing a disturbance." The figure merely glanced about, ignoring the ninja and instead taking in the nervous glances of the people around them. Even here, the people know when they are in a greater presence. There was no visible sign of it, but the stranger seemed to affirm something in their head. "This is far enough then." By now the Jonin was visibly tense, hand straying to his kunai pouch as even more citizens got the message and began to stream away from the potential fight. "Did you just think you would get away with it? All these kids you've stolen from their families. Naruto's tone was conversational, but his eyes were cold as he glared at the man. He had wanted to control himself a bit more, to play this out a bit. Looking at Danzo though, it brought back that surging anger he had felt upon first seeing his sister in full. It was all he could do not to just end the man where he stood. "You are such a disappointment," Danzo said slowly, eyeing up the redhead as if he had all the time in the world. "Your father, while idealistic and naive, was an apparition to our nation's enemies, a bulwark against the thought of attack." The man grimaced. "Face Konoha, and you face the yellow flash. I thought this might lead to a generation of weakened, reliant shinobi, but then came you. You, Itachi and Shisui, such promising talent all too quickly taken under the wing of Hiruzen's damnable ideals. Is this spiel going anywhere or?" Danzo ignored him, straightening as though he were giving one of his speeches to the Shinobi Council. "I had maintained hope you three would prove me wrong, that, outside of my influence, others might come to understand the necessities of our work." Something that might have passed for wistfulness drifted across the old man's face. The roots, feeding the leaves. But no, when Shisui proved difficult and Itachi too patriotic. Naruto's eyes narrowed a fraction. "I was left with you. I'm quite fond of the arrangement myself," he quipped, more by reflex than anything else. "You have your mother's wit, if nobody has ever told you that before," Danzo continued, lip twitching with disdain. "Another promising asset so uselessly wasted, but Mito always was a political player of unequaled skill. No, I knew that if I wanted an Uzumaki, there was only one way. I don't believe I was the only one to benefit from the Kyuubi attack, but when shinobi can't make the best out of a crisis, we are hardly fitting of the name." By now Naruto's hand was itching to launch the kunai into the man's throat, cut off his monologuing the old-fashioned way. "Those who endure." Again, that strange melancholic expression twisted his features, perhaps the only thing Hiruzen and I ever truly agreed on. "Really, I'm starting to think this is just the rambling of senility. If you're stalling for time, I feel I should let you know that any and all of your agents are being rounded up as we speak." Danzo's visible eye narrowed slightly. "I don't doubt, you and your father shared a certain prodigious talent for tactics. Strategy on the other hand, that was always Hiruzen's game. As for stalling? My boy, you haven't the faintest idea. You think me foolish enough to place myself in such a vulnerable position without contingencies? I am so many steps ahead of you it's almost laughable. Why did you think I chose now of all times to return?" There was no longer any doubt that this was an incident of some sort. Umbu had actually congregated on the street, and it was always a bad sign when a Black Ops member touched Konoha soil. The figure still stood there, calmly, even when the Jonin was anything but. "Remove your hat and cloak, then lie down on the ground, hands where I can see them." The figure paused a moment, considering the order. "Very well, this has gone far enough." They removed their hat, carelessly tossing it to the side. Many of the Umbu watching grimaced at the sight beneath. "Konoha shall know pain." "I admire the bluster, Danzo. I'm sure whatever you've planned is just spectacular," Naruto drawled, motioning for the accompanying Umbu to file into the room and surround the man. Danzo himself seemed unruffled, glancing at each of them in turn as he was slowly surrounded before returning his attention to Naruto. "It is unwise for a leader to leave his village unattended for so longer. There are visitors knocking at the door." Naruto only had a moment to furrow his brow at the cryptic statement before the entire room shuddered from some titanic explosion above them. Dust and pieces of the ceiling rained down in showers, forcing Naruto to dive to the side, tackling one of his operatives out of the path of a chunk of falling masonry. By the time he had regained his bearings, Danzo had vanished. Naruto had a sinking feeling he wouldn't show up again. They had secured every exit, but this was Danzo's base at the end of the day. More pressing matters required his attention though, and after a lightning-fast sweep of the room to check on his Umbu guard, he flashed back up to the surface. It was pandemonium. Shinobi flitted this way and that, sometimes carrying civilians away from scenes of carnage as what looked to be enormous summons animals carved messy paths through the village. Other teams of Umbu were struggling to contain the beasts, missing the large chunk of their force Naruto had brought down into the tunnels. It had all the trappings of an invasion, but there was no sign of the opposing force. He managed to flag down a passing kunoichi, the bright red hat slung over his back was good for that at least, to give him a situation report. It's the Akatsuki. We tried to stop one of them but he summoned them, like contract animals. They're too powerful, they keep swatting aside people who try and stop them and dash. Naruto raised a hand, silencing the woman immediately. Calm down. After a few shaky breaths, she managed that. Now, how many are there, where are they and what are they doing? It took her another moment to comport herself, looking a little red in the face after realizing how she had been addressing the Hokage. We think about 6 of them, Hokage-sama. They scattered as soon as they were summoned and right now it looks like they are trying to cause as much chaos as possible. Naruto processed all of that as quickly as possible. 6 Akatsuki? That was a lot of firepower, he hadn't thought they even had that many members left. Still, what did a handful of shinobi, even ones that powerful, hope to accomplish in the middle of a village? An actual attack was out of the question, which left it likely it was a diversion. The Akatsuki's known goals were the Biju, but coming after him in the middle of his own village was either the height of arrogance, or suicide. His eyes narrowed dangerously, he wasn't the only Jinchuriki in the village. Most of the Umbu are underground, start spreading the message to divert the summons animals instead of trying to destroy them, keep them in a contained area until reinforcements can arrive. Continue with the evacuation, anyone not dealing with the animals helps with that. If my village is a battleground I want it exactly that, as few innocent casualties as possible. And the Akatsuki, Hokage-sama. Leave that to Dash. Actually, a whimsical voice cut in, if I could have a moment of your time. Naruto barely had the time to be alarmed before a hand clasped his shoulder. It felt like the world turned to treacle as he felt the unmistakable sensation of a space-time technique take hold. Not wanting to find out what would happen if he let it, he flashed to where he knew a nearby high-ration tag was placed. The village was littered with them. When he reoriented, he saw it was another member of the Akatsuki. The cloak was unmistakable. However, the orange mask, swirling to a singular eye hole, chilled his blood. He would recognize that description anywhere. Ah, the man chided playfully, you ruined my little surprise. I had this awesome thing planned out where we'd zip away and I'd get to monologue all villainously and you could be the dashing hero, and everything. The man's entire countenance shifted abruptly, straightening from his childish slouch to bring the kunai he had placed against the kunoichi's neck even closer, drawing a thin red line across her throat. The hard way then. Even his voice had darkened, taking on a deeper, far more serious tone. I think you'll know where to find me, Hokage-sama, he mocked, just as his entire body seemed to warp and twist in their air, spiraling in on itself and taking the kunoichi with him until they vanished with a whisper of displaced air. The redhead cursed, head darting this way and that as he fretted over his options. The village was under attack and he couldn't just abandon it to go chasing after one man. But then, he had some sense of just how dangerous that one man could be, and to abandon that kunoichi to her fate was like a knife in the gut. People at least were reacting to the invasion. There were troops on the ground and Konoha was hardly lacking strong shinobi, but strong enough to fight 6 Akatsuki members? He took a deep breath to calm himself, Hiruzen's words on trusting in the people under him flashing through his mind. Jiraiya was still in the village, Tsunade was in the village, Kakashi, Guy, the Umbu, his students, all of them were strong. In that moment he resolved himself, the Akatsuki weren't fighting individual shinobi, they were fighting Konoha. He apparently had his own fight, and with that in mind he turned his attention to the top of the monument, where he knew the masked man would be waiting. He would have to make this quick. Pain walked through the village slowly, the streets around him a scene of devastation. His cloak billowed slightly as the concussive force of one of the Azura Path's weapons sent shockwaves through the air. The defense the village was putting up was pathetic, with their vaunted Hokage's attention diverted they were disorganized and rooting. They couldn't even organize enough to contain the animal path's summons, let alone stop him. No force, however great, could stand before Go. Dynamic entry. Pain didn't even have the time to finish his thought before the Deva path was caught by a thunderous kick that sent him careening back across the street. A great plume of dust and smoke rose from the crater he had made in a nearby wall, before that too was pushed back by a wall of invisible force. Yosh! The green beast of Konoha is here villain, prepare to be destroyed by the awesome fires of youth. Pain took one look at the ridiculous specimen of a man before ignoring him entirely, directing the Azura path to deal with him. However, before the mechanical body could unleash a barrage of destructive explosives, a crackling blade of lightning burst through its chest. "Rakery," Kakashi muttered dispassionately, tossing the now limp body to the side and turning to eye up the real threat. From his revealed Sharingan, it was clear the Kopinen was already taking this seriously. "Ah, eternal rival. That was a most unyouthful sneak attack. You should always announce your presence with fiery zeal." Kakashi blinked lazily, never taking his eye off the Deva path. "Sorry guy, did you say something?" The spandexed man visibly recoiled in pain, tears suddenly streaming down his cheeks. "As hip as ever, my friend. But I shall not be outdone." He sobered up again, squaring himself against pain and settling into a deceptively average taijutsu stance. "The Akatsuki has befouled my home, and if I am unable to defeat them here, then dash." His further ranting was cut off when Pain grew irritated by the asinine display, lifting a single hand and blasting Guy across the street with much greater force than he had been kicked. "Shinra Tensei." Kakashi's eyes narrowed imperceptibly, doing his best to analyze what had just happened, but even his eye drew a blank. The man's chakra was strange, more like a cloud within his body than flowing through the usual pathways. There had been a brief concentration around the eyes when he performed his technique, but as for what he had actually done, the Sharingan simply drew a blank. Fancy name for a simple technique, he hazarded in his usual drawl, when in doubt, stall for backup. Something told him he may be in a little over his head here. "With it alone I have the power to level this pitiful village, you have far more immediate concerns however." Kakashi's eyes widened as he heard movement behind him, leaning to the side just in time for a black canister to shoot past his head. Again, Pain raised his hand and the resulting explosion splashed harmlessly against some invisible shield in front of him. Kakashi wasn't so lucky as the sheer force of the blast threw him back. He had just enough wherewithal to twist his body out of the way of a silvery blade, landing with grace on the other side of the man he thought he had already killed. So, since when does a hole through the chest not put someone down? He mused nervously, noting that the bald Akatsuki member in front of him looked immaculate, even his robe was undamaged. That just seems unfair. His Sharingan caught another of the figures, a stocky man with the same orange hair and piercings as the apparent leader, retreating back into a side alley. Acting on that intuitive sense that had served him throughout his career, he flashed through a series of hand seals faster than most could blink and sent a large fireball hurtling after him. It was intercepted by a plump man bearing the same hair and markings. As Kakashi watched, his technique dwindled away to nothing before the man's raised hands. At that he could only grimace. "Any other broken little tricks I should know about? I am not so easily done away with, fiend." Guy bellowed as he broke free of the rubble he had been buried under, glancing around furtively at all the new faces. "What is going on here, Kakashi?" Spotting an opportunity, the silver-haired Jonin motioned after the fleeing figure. "That one guy, go after him." "Yosh." Guy acted without hesitation, pumping his arms at his sides as he was suddenly enveloped in a green corona. Two of the paths moved to intercept but he shot right past them in an emerald blur, taking off after the fleeing Naraka path. Which, of course, left Kakashi standing there, surrounded by the other three. They looked none too happy about the development. Without any outward sign of communication, the tubby one that had intercepted his technique darted off after Guy, while the one Kakashi had already killed once launched himself forward. His hands seemed to fold back like some impossibly complex puppet, revealing two spinning, serrated blades. Kakashi squared himself to redirect the blades with another rakery, aware of how much of a dent that would put in his reserves, only to have his vision filled by a mane of white hair. The world was filled with the deafening screech of a Rasengan plowing into metal, before the Azura path had a hole punched through it, again. The apparently mechanical person stood there a moment, Jiraiya's arm elbow deep in its chest, before weakly swinging at the sun and only to slump to the side. Kakashi felt like burning the rest of it for good measure. "You go after bowl cut, I got this one," Jiraiya muttered softly, his voice lacking any of its usual mirth as the older man turned to face the Deva path, face grim. Kakashi idly noted that Jiraiya could actually be quite commanding when he dropped the Kabuki act, before racing after Guy. After all, if Jiraiya couldn't handle this guy, what chance in hell did he have? Jiraiya didn't take his eyes off the orange-haired man as the Kopinen raced off. The man seemed likewise intrigued by him. Yahiko, he acknowledged softly. Jiraiya-sensei, Pain returned, sounding almost bemused. Naruto had no hydration markers in the small forest atop the Hokage monument, so he arrived in the little clearing in a small whirl of leaves. He stood atop a tree branch, staring down the masked man and wary for any traps he may have set up. The man himself just stood there, the now gagged kunoichi held up by her hair with the kunai at her throat. She was trying to compose herself, gaining a hopeful smile at seeing her Hokage arrive, but she was still trembling slightly. Did I get the wrong one? The man asked, once again adopting that childish persona. You're not Shunshin no Shisui, right? Stop messing around, Naruto said, dropping to the ground and walking forward cautiously, attention split between the mask that set his teeth on edge, and the kunai hovering ponderously like a tiny sword of Damocles. Oh, but messing around is the only fun you can have in this dull, broken world, isn't it? I would have thought you'd learn at least that from your pretty fiancé. Naruto twitched slightly, but refused to rise to the bait. What do you want? The man tooted, shaking his head like a disappointed parent. No, too soon. We have to draw this out. Really, it's like I'm dealing with an amateur. First, I make my grand, monologuing speech where I lay out my plans along with all the hideously evil atrocities I've committed. Then you make a pithy retort while laying some unseen trap. I make some grand gesture, allowing you to rescue my hostage in the nick of time, followed by our amazing and climactic battle, determining the fate of the village and all the lives in it. He finished with a sweeping gesture of both hands, momentarily bringing the kunai away from the woman's throat. Naruto just grit his teeth, eyes darting about the clearing for any hint of an advantage. If you insist. The man's voice lost all its playfulness in an instant. Well, now I'm not in the mood anymore. His hand fell like a pendulum and time seemed to slow to a crawl as Naruto rocketed forward, pulling every ounce of speed out of his legs as physically possible. It took him 2 strides to streak across the open ground, leaving tiny craters where his feet met the ground. Just before the man could slice the kunoichi's throat, he tackled her backwards, the kunai leaving a neat scar across the Hokage hat instead. When he rolled to a stop, cradling the woman in his arms, he knew something was off when the man refused to press his attack. He almost missed the faint hissing from the blood pounding in his ears, but he caught it in time to rip off the kunoichi's headband and fling it towards the man, sheltering her with his body. It exploded a moment later, pelting him with dirt and little clumps of earth and leaving an incessant ringing in his ears. The man strolled out of the smoke cloud without so much as a hair out of place. Naruto could almost feel the grin beneath the mask. That's more like it. A heroic rescue, quick thinking and a devious trap reversal. Now I know I picked the right guy. The Hokage bit back a snarl, using his opponent's flair for the dramatic to give the kunoichi a quick once-over. She seemed alright, if a bit frightened. Without flourish he pulled out one of his kunai, stuck it in the ground and vanished in a flash of red, depositing the woman amongst the surprised gasps of one of the civilian bunkers before flashing away again. The man hadn't moved in the brief moment he was gone except to mime looking at a watch. What took you? Oh, don't worry, Naruto said, doing his best to keep his voice even, you have my full attention now. He launched forward again, a large Rasengan swirling into place over his palm as he moved. The distance between them might as well not have existed for all the time it took for him to cross it, driving the grinding ball of chakra right into the man's chest. Only for it to pass right through. Oh no, it appears that. The man started, only to trail off when he realized the namikaze hadn't overbalanced and fallen through his body like most did. Instead he stood there, holding the screeching ball of chakra right inside his chest cavity, a small grin starting to spread his whiskered cheeks. The redhead met his masked opponent right in the eye and allowed himself a small, vindictive smile. You're not the only one who's done their homework. Chapter 48, Official Invasions. The hum of the Rasengan seemed to wash out all the usual sounds of the forest. It was that mix of deep, tremulous drone, and grating, high-pitched whine that made it sound as dangerous as it was. For all the good it did when it couldn't connect with the target. If he was honest with himself, Naruto actually had no idea how long he could hold one, he'd never had much impetus to learn. While it was admittedly harder to form than it was to maintain, it still took consistent effort to keep spinning. Well, this is new, the masked man said, looking down at the arm emerging from his chest. He took an experimental backwards step only to have Naruto follow him precisely. He leapt to the side with almost flamboyant exaggeration and Naruto followed him to a T. If I run off the mountain, are you going to follow me? Your mother would tell you not to, of course, but, oh, wait. He leaned forward and Naruto didn't need to see under the mask to know he was goading him. Upon the redhead's continued silence the man sighed, straightening back up. Still, very weird. Occasionally people work out a few aspects of my ability while we fight. Having somebody already know? Well, that feels a bit cheaty, don't you think? He leaned in conspiratorially, stage whispering, who clued you in? Come on, I won't tell. Was it old man Teiuchi over at the ramen stand? He leaned back and threw his hands up in the air. I knew I shouldn't have told him my deepest darkest secrets, but that ramen was too delicious. Naruto thought he actually heard a cicada chirp over the constant buzz of the Rasengan. The man slumped pathetically, only to suddenly leap back in an attempt to take the Hokage off guard. Naruto followed him all the same. Come on. How boring of a fight is this? Us, just standing here, waiting for one of our techniques to time out. Where's your sense of drama? Where's the panache? Why aren't you saying anything? He flailed his arms childishly, phasing right through Naruto instead of landing any blows. Seriously, you're not even setting me up for the awesome moment where I reveal I've had my ally sneaking up on you this whole time. Naruto pivoted so fast that the Rasengan sliced a blue crescent through the air as he turned. He hadn't sensed the thing creeping up on him until the man had announced its presence, and was almost too late to stop it latching onto him. The increasingly dense ball of chakra slammed into its head with all the force of a wrecking ball, splattering pieces of goopy white flesh in every direction. Where they landed, little saplings sprouted from the earth. He had no idea what it was. Without a head, it just had the body of an androgynous human with small bud-like protrusions across its body. Its skin was porcelain white and looked like it had the texture of a shaved tree. The most disconcerting thing though was that until it had appeared behind him, it was basically a black spot on his senses, completely invisible. Oh, that was fast, the man exclaimed with childish awe. But, what are you going to do about the other ones? Naruto glanced up to find a small army of the things emerging from the trees around them. For a moment he cursed his luck, before sighing and reaching into his kunai pouch. Silence reigned as teacher and student stared across at one another. I thought you were dead, all three of you, Jiraiya said, uncertain of how to feel. To find out that the dangerous mercenary group he had been hunting for the past few years was headed by a former student, it was a good thing he was the master of his emotions. Yahiko is dead, I am pain. Some of the sadness must have slipped through the cracks in his mask as the Deva Path's features hardened. What happened to Nagato, why do you have his eyes, Yahiko? The orange-haired man remained impassive, but there was a slight tightening about his eyes. I told you, Yahiko is dead. He raised his hand ponderously. You will soon learn the feeling, sensei. The wall of sheer force was as powerful as it was unannounced. Jiraiya's hair immediately hardened into a protective spiky shell that anchored him to the ground, but even so, he still dug a small trench on his way backwards. When the pressure finally relented he released his technique, but pain was already there. He kicked the older man hard enough to crater the wall behind him and didn't relent, immediately charging in again. When Jiraiya launched an enormous fireball at him he simply raised a hand and charged right though, the invisible shield diverting the attack around him. It was a smokescreen though, he emerged on the other side to find Jiraiya staring down at him from a rooftop, his features grim. Whatever happened to you three, whatever your motivations for all of this? You made a mistake in attacking Konoha. We are only doing as you taught us, Jiraiya-sensei. A softer voice cut in. Thin sheets seemed to peel themselves off the surrounding buildings, fluttering into the air in a technique Jiraiya remembered all too well. They swirled artfully for a moment before coalescing to the form of a bored-looking blue-haired woman, with the addition of enormous papery wings stretching from her back. You've grown into a beautiful young woman, Konan, Jiraiya offered with a sad smile. Is Nagato going to join us too? This is turning into a veritable reunion. His normally joking tone was tempered by a wistful edge. Nagato is dead, there is only pain, came the predictable response, only this time the Deva path didn't press his attack, simply crossing his arms imperiously. It was Konan who moved forward, sheets of paper peeling away from her form and folding as if by invisible hands into innocuous-looking shuriken. They certainly didn't act like paper though. When she sent a cloud of them at Jiraiya they dug into the stonework just as well as metal. He whipped his hair and batted most of them away, his vision blocked just long enough that the 3 enormous paper shuriken caught him a little off guard. His look of shock only lasted until one buried itself in his chest. It quickly morphed into a smirk as he vanished in a puff of smoke, a bifurcated log clattering to the ground in his place. Find him, Pain ordered, earning a nod from his lieutenant before she took to the air for a better view. Guy thundered around a corner with reckless abandon, the cloud of rapidly evaporating sweat around his body turning him into a green comet. His quarry was wily, making good use of the sharp turns in the street to neutralize a guy's speed. But then, Guy was very fast with 3 gates open. He bounded off a wall, almost running with his body parallel to the ground from his sheer momentum, and twisted his body into a bone-breaking spinning kick. The tall man he had been told to chase ducked with almost prescient timing, letting the green beast sail overhead and turning on a dime to head back the way he came. By the time Guy touched the ground and could correct his trajectory, causing bits of the aforementioned ground to go flying off in the other direction, he had already vanished into the maze of streets. Not one to be deterred easily, or at all, Guy took the opportunity to jump directly up, leaping into the sky like a hysterical rabbit. After that it was all too easy to spot his quarry and begin the chase anew. He caught up with the stocky man meeting up with another of the orange-haired invaders, this one with long hair styled like a Yamanaka. Both of them seemed to be carrying the remains of a third, the one his eternal rival had so unyouthfully dispatched. How they had managed to bring his body all the way here in such a short amount of time didn't even pass through the man's mind. That, and the oddity that they seemed to be feeding it to some grotesque creature that quite literally sprouted from the ground, wreathed in sickly purple flames that physically hurt to look at. He powered through the wrongness of the scene and cheerfully announced his presence once again. Konoha Whirlwind. The animal path caught sight of him first, the Naruto path whirling half a second later. That was enough time for Guy to skid into the space between them, sweeping low with his legs to knock out the animal path space before fluidly continuing the motion to lash out with an anatomically improbable kick to the Naruto path's chin. The technique was completed when he came full circle and caught the still airborne animal path with a brutal punch to the midsection. For a moment, the Akatsuki member seemed to fold around his arm before flying back into a nearby building. The energetic taijutsu master was about to turn around and finish the Naruto path, as he had been directed, when one he hadn't seen before, a portly one with slicked back hair, was suddenly between them. This one caught his blow easily, redirecting it and nearly causing Guy to unbalance. Instead of leaving himself open to a counter-attack, the spandexed man rolled with the motion, catching himself with one hand and using the new leverage to spin into an inverted helicopter kick. The bigger man leaned back, shifting to press his attack, only to be forced at the last minute to turn, putting his hands forward to absorb a crackling dog made of lightning that had charged him from behind. "If you hadn't noticed, I was fighting this one guy," he drawled, giving a pointed look at the Akatsuki member in question. "Of course, my hip companion. But, just this once, I feel it may be better to defeat these villains together." Kakashi considered the scene as the Naruto path was hauled to his feet by the newly revitalized Azura path. Kakashi was already sick of seeing that one die. "Okay fine, but don't tell anyone." He dropped his weight slightly, eyes narrowing at the orange-haired invaders. "I have a mystique to maintain." Enormous wooden stakes burst from the street, twisting unnaturally in an attempt to ensnare and impale the enormous rhino summons rampaging through the village. While Tenzo was dealing with that, his attention was also on the concerted effort to redirect an even larger centipede, something he didn't even know he never wanted to see, towards a trap being lain by an Umbu squad. He cursed the utility of his Kekai Genkai for what felt like the 100th time, and threw in a small curse at Orochimaru, Hashirama Senju, and a few others for good measure. He wasn't used to this kind of endurance with his ability. He was no first Hokage, and the constant expectations that he should be were starting to wear on him. He was already ragged just from the effort of dealing with all of these summons, and they hadn't even managed to kill one yet. His concentration was split in too many directions, and that was with the help of 4 wood clones backing up various squads. He was running on fumes at this point. Another curse left his lips as, instead of backing off from the curved wooden wall he had created to divert the centipede, the thing simply dived into the ground, burrowing right into the earth. He ignored it, hoping another team would pick that up and turned back to the rhino. With more mental focus on his stakes he managed to tangle up the beast's legs. There was a brief moment of regret as the thing's momentum took it right through one of his favorite restaurants. It was quickly replaced by cool pragmatism as he directed the stakes to impale the creature and send it back wherever it came from. He was too focused just keeping it pinned to note the strange rumbling beneath his feet. He noticed too late to fully avoid the centipede bursting from the earth, crying out as one of its razor-sharp mandibles clipped his shoulder, sending him spinning to the side. The overlarge arthropod wasted no time in turning to finish the job, rearing up on its segmented body and clicking at him threateningly. He shifted to move out of the way, only to have his arm collapse under him, leaving him sprawled on the ground. Sensing its opportunity, the summons immediately lunged. Ami, now! Both predator and prey turned in time to see Sasuke leaping off of the flat of Ami's blade like a springboard. It looked like he was holding daggers of pure fire, and put them to good use when he slammed into the side of the summon's head. It let out a horrendous squeal as white-hot flame sliced through its carapace like butter. Sasuke stabbed it in one of its bulbous eyes for good measure before diving backwards. With an angered cry the centipede made to bifurcate the Uchiha while he was in the air, and likely would have if, at that moment, Ami didn't suddenly substitute with him. For a moment it seemed like the Violet had simply traded her life for his, but, and Tenzo wasn't quite sure he believed what he saw, she proceeded to step off the air, neatly dodging the creature's mandibles like she was skirting around another swordsman. Using leverage that simply didn't exist, the girl stepped forward as surely as if she was on solid ground, driving her wind-sheathed blade into the summon's neck, before allowing gravity to reclaim her. The sight of her blade shearing effortlessly through the creature's chitin as she fell, leaving an enormous gash down the length of its body, was one Tenzo wouldn't soon forget. Though, it was arguable that was the smell of its guts falling out. "Where are you injured?" Sakura asked in the brusque tone of every paramedic Tenzo had ever known. Her attention shifted to his shoulder, hands glowing, before he could even answer. The Mokuton user was initially confused as to why she wasn't with the other medics at the various emergency centers that had no doubt been set up at strategic points around the village. "Sakura. On your right." The casual, unconcerned way Sasuke called out was sharply contrasted by what Tenzo saw when he craned his neck to look over his medic. The rhino summon was shaking its way out of its wooden bonds, snorting great gusts of air as it struggled to its feet. Tenzo shifted to deal with it only to be gently, but forcefully, pushed back down by Sakura. She gave him a stern look before standing to face the beast. "Don't move, doctor's orders." It was just getting to its feet, turning awkwardly to face the group, as Sakura squared herself between it and her patient. She flashed through a quick chain of hand seals, and it was only because of Tenzo's innate grasp of earth techniques that he knew she had surreptitiously hardened the ground beneath her, with 2 wedges of rock tilting her feet forward slightly. The rhino seemed enraged by her refusal to move, grunting a challenge before charging down the street at a dead sprint. Tenzo very nearly moved anyway, only to freeze in astonishment as Sakura met the charge head-on, waiting until the last moment before suddenly slamming it with an earth-shattering overhead blow. She caught the beast right on the edge of its nose and suddenly all of the forward momentum was driven straight down. The ground cratered. Notably, the earth in a 2-foot radius of Sakura only shuddered, but outside of that it was as though someone had dropped a small meteor on the street. The rhino itself was probably out cold before its face stopped digging into the street. Sakura had already turned her attention back to her patient. The swiftness with which she returned to treating his wound left him speechless for the entire 30 seconds it actually took her to finish up. "All right, you should be fine, but if you get another one like that you'll have to go to one of the rally points for more thorough healing," she said. "You'll also need a soldier pill, you're dangerously low on chakra." "Come on Sakura, we need to move on," Sasuke says he's got a way to take down that weird drill-beaked bird. Okay, one moment, the pinkette called over her shoulder before giving Tenzo one last once-over. Satisfied, she gave him a professional nod and a decidedly less professional smile. Stay safe. With that she immediately took off after her teammates, the three of them quickly rounding a corner in a textbook umbu formation that could have only come from their teacher. It was around that point that Tenzo remembered to blink. Monsters, training monsters. The human path observed the quiet little house. It was tucked away towards the outskirts of the village, in the quiet district between the markets and some of the larger clan compounds. It would have been innocuous enough to normalize, but through his rinnegan it glowed brilliantly. The sheer number and variety of seals was impressive enough, but the way they threaded together around and throughout the property weaved a beautiful tapestry of light. The path regarded it all dispassionately, a thin black rod sliding out of his sleeve which he quickly impaled into the ground. Immediately he saw that grand tapestry waver as parts of the matrix were disrupted. He felt no satisfaction as, one by one, various seals overloaded or failed, the chakra leaking out and dispersing into the air. He was about to step forward, only to pause as different, previously inactive seals suddenly flared to life, fueled by the released chakra of their counterparts. As one, the entire matrix suddenly flared back to full strength. Without his eyes, he would have walked right into that trap. Interesting. You've been working on your Shikigami techniques, I see, Jiraiya remarked, suddenly running alongside where Konan was gliding through the streets. If she was surprised by the sudden appearance, she didn't show it. You always told us that complacency was death for shinobi, she replied, whipping her arm out and sending a barrage of razor-sharp sheets at her former mentor. The Sunin dodged them with a grace that belied his age, keeping a jovial smile as they kept pace with one another. I always did try to make my students take the important lessons to heart. His expression sobered a moment later. What is all of this, Konan? What happened to you three? The starving little orphans I remember could never be capable of all of this. You were never capable of this. Life happened, Jiraiya-sensei. Life, and pain, and war. We all make sacrifices for it, as you know better than anybody else. You should be proud of us, soon we will have created a world of peace. Her hand shot out again and this time a small army of paper cranes folded itself into existence, speeding after the toad sage-like self-correcting kunai. He pivoted mid-stride, suddenly running backwards as he held up a tiger seal. The stream of fire he breathed out was concentrated enough to turn white, melting the roof tiles nearby. The origami birds, even empowered by Konan's chakra, stood no chance and were incinerated. That isn't what I taught you. No, Jiraiya-sensei, that was a lesson taught to us the hard way, Konan intoned softly, the first hint of emotion he had seen on her face. He hated that it was sadness. Then I know not to treat you lightly, Jiraiya said with a sigh. On the contrary, sensei, you still underestimate us. When Jiraiya touched down on the next rooftop, it seemed to come alive, hundreds of exploding tags suddenly rising up to latch onto any part of him they could until he looked like some strangely patterned mummy. Goodbye, sensei, Konan whispered as the tags all ignited simultaneously. Her own wings immediately arched in front of her to shield her from the resulting blast. The building itself was flattened, but even with the air almost unbearably scorched, Konan hazarded a look. Her eyes narrowed a hair when she spotted the faint wisps of white smoke from within the cloud of dust and ash. They widened again when the implication hit her. Nagato. The novelty of the self-sustaining ward system had worn off very quickly. The human path had taken to judiciously spearing the various seals with the disruptive rods. Whatever they were supposed to do, or were trying to do, the injection of his own chakra appeared enough to destroy or weaken them that they became a negligible afterthought once he reached the door. Aside from the defunct seals on it, it was also locked in the more traditional sense. This was swiftly corrected by a thunderous kick that had the door, as well as a large chunk of the wall where the lock had been installed, fly off its hinges. The lights within were all off, and for a moment he wondered if the occupants had fled to the shelters in the mountain. The memories of the people he had killed indicated the woman was the proud type, unlikely to go running in the face of invasion. As if to prove him right, the next step he took tripped some kind of wire trap that had a flurry of senbon fill the air in front of him. He deflected most of them, but a few managed to nick his arms and legs. Despite the slight sheen he could see coating the deadly little implements, he remained unconcerned. Poison could no longer affect these bodies. Blunt force trauma on the other hand. He caught the first spiked ball easily, also coated in that same sticky liquid. It proved enough of a distraction that the second one caught him in the back of the head. It didn't damage him too much, but was irritating. Shelving his emotional response, the fact that the traps had triggered without him taking a step was telling. If they were seal-based his eyes would have warned him. Somebody was operating them. With his quarry now in sight he moved on into the house. They could trap every inch, it still wouldn't stop God. The sight of a deserted market square in the middle of a busy village like Konoha might have been disconcerting to some. Pain ignored it. He had purposefully diverted the bulk of the shinobi away from his position, dealing with the summoned animals and evacuating the positions his Azura path was strategically bombing. This left him a straight path to the Yamanaka grounds, where memories the human path had assimilated told him he would find the Nanabi Jinchuriki. Having already been thwarted twice in that regard, he didn't intend to fail a third time. His eyes warned of a sudden influx of chakra into the ground beneath him, but it happened too fast for him to disrupt. The ground was reduced to a swampy quagmire in less than a second, trapping his feet and securing him in place. Far from panicking, the orange-haired man simply turned his gaze to where Jiraiya had alighted on a nearby rooftop. "This has gone far enough, Yahiko. When will you learn, sensei?" the Rinnegan user intoned, loud enough that his voice echoed around the square. "Yahiko is dead." He extended his hands to either side, eyes pulsing with chakra. "There is only pain." The swampy earth recoiled from the invisible bubble or pure force her projected, only to snap back into place like elastic, closing over his feet again. "Well, now pain is stuck in a swamp," Jiraiya mocked, slamming his hands on the ground. "Kuchi Yasei no Jutsu." The Deva path was briefly buffeted by displaced air as something big was forcefully brought into the world. When the smoke cleared it revealed an enormous toad, the size of a biju. The pipe and haori it wore, like some Ryo novel Yakuza boss, might have been amusing under different circumstances. The enormous, scaled-up Tonto at its side, most certainly was not. "What are you doing summoning me in the middle of the village, Jiraiya, you pickle-brained agent? You know how hard it is for me to move without wrecking stuff." The toad grumbled, his voice booming across the village. Around them the various scenes of destruction and rampaging summons paused, taking in the odd sight. "Not the time, Bunta, just hit that guy already." Jiraiya called out in exasperation as the moment passed and the invasion continued. "Summoning me out the middle of my poker game, for one little guy." Gamabunta grumbled, but complied all the same. He drew his Tonto in a deceptively fluid movement, immediately bringing it overhead to slam the Deva path into oblivion. "Shinra Tensei." The blade stopped abruptly, shuddering in the air as it fought back the titanic force pain had so causally summoned. Gamabunta grunted, bringing his other hand to bear and pushing down even harder. Slowly, inch by muscle straining inch, the sword descended. After 5 seconds though, when the blade was scant centimeters from the Deva path's head, his eyes pulsed again and the blade suddenly lurched back into the air, ripped right out of Gamabunta's hands. Pain wasted no time, black rods sliding out of his sleeves which he quickly planted in the swampy ground. With the technique destabilized he was able to pull his feet out of the muck. Now thoroughly irritated, he pointed a hand at the still reeling boss summons. Bansho Tenin. Under normal circumstances, the recipient of the technique would have flown uncontrollably towards him. With the enormous weight disparity between them, the reverse happened, with Pain suddenly flying forward towards the enormous toad. He slammed into Gamabunta's stomach with the impact of a small meteor, toppling the giant before proceeding to walk calmly along his length. When he reached the middle of the dazed toad he wasted no time in pointing his hand down. "Shinra Tensei." Gamabunta cried out, a booming noise that rattled nearby windows. The ground splintered beneath him as the force was dissipated through his body, but he didn't dispel. Pain kept his hand where it was, leveling a pointed look over to where Jiraiya was watching, immobile. "Your efforts are futile, Jiraiya-sensei. Call all the help you like, you only condemn them to the same fate." He turned his attention back to the toad beneath him, flexing his hand slightly. "Shinra Ten-. Hiae." The sword slammed into his side without warning, the enormous blade acting more like a titanic bludgeon than a cutting instrument. The sheer force of it must have been enough to momentarily disrupt the connection as, the next thing he knew, he was lying in a pile of rubble, looking at the vaguely human-shaped holes he had made on his flight through 3 different buildings. At the other end was the slug Sunin, holding up Gamabunte's sword like an ant holding up a tree branch. Pain let out a deep exhale, picking himself up and brushing the dust from his robe. This was starting to irritate him. Little unnatural shrubs now decorated the clearing. Wherever these things bled, plant life sprung right up. Naruto breathed heavily in the middle of it all. Killing armies was the Hiraishin's specialty, but there were a lot of these things, and they just kept coming. Well, the masked man announced, he had been rambling all through the melee, even introducing himself as Tobi at one point, although Naruto didn't believe that name for a second. As entertaining as it is to see you flash around the place, this clearly isn't getting us anywhere. He snapped his fingers and the plant people stopped coming, the last one dropping, headless, as Naruto finished driving a Rasengan through its skull. You mean it's not getting you anywhere? The Hokage shot back with a wicked grin. I've just finished getting warmed up. Yes, Tobi drawled, waving his hand airily. Witty banter, sarcastic rejoinder, pithy retort etc., etc. A large gunbei suddenly appeared in his hand in a puff of smoke, the chain attached to its handle snaking up his sleeve. I think I've just about gotten to the point where I decide to what was it again? His voice darkened in that abrupt manner of his. Oh right, deal with you myself. Well, a new and all too familiar voice cut in from the edge of the clearing that clenched at Naruto's heart painfully. I feel unwelcome now. Itachi, my boy. Tobi exclaimed brightly, waving his gunbei enthusiastically at the Uchiha prodigy. Just in time to join the climactic battle against your old teammate. I couldn't write the poetry better if I orchestrated all of this. The man paused, putting a finger to his chin. Oh right, I did. If we could skip the charade, Madara, Itachi intoned blandly, turning to face the Hokage and bringing the redhead up short with the revelation. Ugh, that's no fun. Tobi, or Madara, huffed, before sighing theatrically. But then, I never could say no to family. Both Uchiha turned to face Naruto, who by this point had regained his breath and was glancing at them both warily, eyes never straying above Itachi's chest. Itachi. Naruto. Congratulations on the promotion. Thanks, I've got to admit the hat's growing on me. The Haori is new. A present from Anko. Ah, and she's well. Pregnant with our first child actually. I never thought her the motherly type. It was a bit of a surprise to everyone really. I can imagine. Tobi coughed into his hand, bringing the attention back to him. I'm sorry, am I interrupting? Itachi gave him a flat look. Yes, as a matter of fact. But if you insist on dealing with this matter quickly. His form suddenly broke apart into a murder of crows, their cawing echoing around the clearing far louder than would have been natural. Naruto cursed, never noticing he had been placed under a genjutsu. Itachi must have woven it while hidden in the tree line. His eyes darted about, trying to keep every single crow in his eyeline while simultaneously fluctuating his chakra to break free. He kept his guard up even as the world shattered around him, the crows fading away and Itachi phasing back into existence. The Uchiha stood there, firm, eyes set in hard gaze with the Sharingan spinning languidly. Tobi looked down at the sword protruding from his chest and blinked once. Huh. That's it for part 11. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.